I'm Ryan Ball. I work at Electrona, and today I'm going to talk to you about SwiftUI for macOS. I had a talk literally right before this, and kind of one of the things that you find when you're looking for resources about SwiftUI, you find a ton of stuff for iOS, but you don't find a bunch of stuff for macOS. So that's really what this talk is about, SwiftUI specifically for macOS. And this thing is just going to sleep, so it's going great so far. Yeah, I'm real, I've said it, I've seen the numbers of the people registering for this talk go up and up, and I've said it like to my team members who I think have been annoyed by it, and it's really like my way, if I'm being vulnerable, of like normalizing it for myself, because it's, sometimes I get kind of almost like imposter syndrome, like in situations like this, because it's like, oh, I don't know if I belong here. But hopefully you enjoy the talk and you get something out of it. So yeah, SwiftUI. This is kind of Apple's kind of tagline: better apps, less code, right? Problem is, it doesn't build itself. So we have to do that, right? So again, the challenge that we have is building an app, a simple app for SwiftUI, or in SwiftUI for macOS that you actually can use. So if you thought that in this, in 60 minutes you were going to learn Swift or SwiftUI, it's probably not going to happen. Yeah, sorry. But what I find really helpful, again, is when I go looking for examples, to have a nice example of a SwiftUI app for macOS where we're doing a few things, and you can see, I'm gonna show a ton of examples, and I'm gonna outline kind of what things are doing in the code. I'm gonna provide you with the code. I'm not gonna give you I thought about the best way to do this, and oftentimes you see, okay, here's the project, build the thing, and then we'll kind of talk about it. But then you could just leave afterwards, and I don't really want to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'll talk about kind of how we construct the app. I'm going to provide you with files that include code, and we'll go through that code and outline what that code is doing. And then hopefully at the end of the talk, you have a functioning app that does something. Me and my team members, we talked about kind of what app should we do? And we threw around a couple ideas, and actually kind of independently, two of my team members mentioned creating an app that can unsign a mobile config file. So that's what we're going to do, create an app that can unsign a mobile config or profile. If you've ever tried to open a signed profile, what you're going to see here is double-clicking on this and it kind of opening, but you have to right-click and open in something. But if you viewed the contents of one of these things when it's signed, you don't get what you expect to see, right? So you open it maybe in VS Code, or I think this is VS Codium in this example, and we go ahead and open it, and it kind of looks something like this. It just, you have no idea, it's just gobbledygook, right? Every time I wanted to unsign a profile, typically the use case for me is downloading a profile from Jamf Pro, right? You download the profile from Jamf Pro, and you want to open it up, kind of see what it's doing, and you really can't. And then what I always did is I Googled, and I'm like, okay, let's get a good example of this. And I talked to Ben prior to this to make sure he was cool with this. Ben's or Mac Mule, if you maybe know him as that, his blog, he's got a good post specifically about this. And he has a command that he posted in this blog to do just that. It actually leverages OpenSSL. That command looks like this. It's two parts. The first part is removing the signature of the mobile config file, and again, it uses OpenSSL. And then it's not really, it does unsign the profile, but it's not very pretty. So then you come back along and use plutil to convert that XML into kind of pretty form. So this is two parts. That's a little more complicated than what I wanted to do, so I wanted to find kind of a different way. So a shorter method could be using the security command. So if you do man security, if you scroll down a little bit, there's a CMS subcommand, and there's a -D flag for that CMS subcommand that can actually decode a signed profile. And as we kind of look a little bit further down, hopefully you can see this. I try to make it as big as possible. There are two other flags. There's an in-file flag and out-file flag. So basically what our command would look like, if we were going to do this in terminal, would look something like this. Security CMS -D, again, we're going to decrypt that profile. We're going to have an input file, which is what I'm calling here source, and then an output file for the destination. So that's our command that we would use to unsign the profile. So another kind of cool example of what this app is going to do is be able to run a shell command. So you'll get that. So yeah, commit this to memory, and we'll come back to something kind of like this. So software you need, obviously, if you want to go through this, you're going to need Xcode. If you want to install Xcode, don't even bother, because it's going to take you about an hour in this. Optionally, SF Symbols app. It's Apple's app to essentially kind of get information about the symbols that are that you have available in SwiftUI. And you can get that, again, it's optional, but something I'll go through as well. A bunch of this talk is going to be about just setting the project up, because that's an issue for some people. So when you create a project in Xcode, basically you're going to choose macOS, and then you're going to choose the app here, and then next. If you want to follow along, you definitely can. If not, perfectly fine. The slide will be available. The files that I'll give you will be available afterwards too, so you can play around with it after that. If we go on here, it's pretty straightforward. You name the project. Basically, this is the name of the app. In this case, Intro to SwiftUI app is what I've called it. You can see, I think by default now, the interface should be SwiftUI, language is Swift, so you shouldn't have to adjust anything else. And then we'll move on there. So this is basically the default app that is created when you create a SwiftUI app in Xcode. You can actually build this, so see a working version of this app with this kind of play button. You basically hit that, the app's going to run for you. Optionally, you can use Command B as a shortcut if you like shortcuts to build the app. And basically, again, there's a preview option in Xcode when you use SwiftUI. I tend to not use that as much. I like to see what the actual app looks like. So I build early and often, so hopefully you can see that. And this is what the app looks like, the default app. It's Hello World, right? Never seen that before. But yeah, you've built the app, and pretty much we're done, right? Yeah, thanks. Comedy. No. So let's take a look at what the app actually looks like, right? So yeah, let's dissect that app. So the first thing we're going to look at is the app struct file, and I'll give you a little bit of information about what that actually is. So the app struct file is basically the main entry point of the application. And that app struct file includes an @main, which is referencing main. So again, main entry point of that app. The body of that app struct file contains one or more scenes. In our example, it's a window group and a content view, and we'll show you that. A data model can be used to basically initialize in that app struct file to essentially handle kind of background tasks and things that are not related specifically to the user interface itself. And that app struct file is typically named after the app. Whatever you put in that field where you name the app, it's typically that plus app. So if you actually named it Intro to SwiftUI app, this file is going to be named Intro to SwiftUI app, just so you know. And this is what that file looks like, right? So it's pretty straightforward. You have the main here. again, the entry point of the application itself. And then in the window group, the window group references the window that's going to be displayed. You have a view. That default view is called content view. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And again, this is the default app, so we've not kind of gone into the actual app that we're building. So SwiftUI views, basically, they represent the user interface. So anything related to view is, it could be anything from a text label to an entire view that contains everything that you see on the screen, right? So every piece of the UI basically is a view or a modified view. And views can contain other views. So you can have a view within a view within a view. Views on views, right? So everything essentially that you see would be a view, again, or a modified view. And then you use what's called a modifier, and I'll show you that, to change the appearance or the behavior of those views. And there's a lot that you can do with modifiers. And then you use stacks to arrange views around. So a stack could be a V stack, which is essentially a vertical stack. So you're stacking things like this. And they have horizontal stacks where you're stacking things kind of horizontally. They have Z stacks where you're stacking things kind of in front of each other and you can stagger them. But stacks are used to arrange views on your UI. And clicks don't work. So yeah, essentially, let's take a look at what our content view, our main view looks like versus what we're seeing kind of in the real world. So you have a V stack, a vertical stack, right? On top of that stack is an image, and on the bottom of that stack is the text, hello world, and then you have padding around it. It's kind of hard to visualize this. So the way that I like to do this, as you're first kind of starting out in SwiftUI, is to use borders. So you wrap things in borders. So this may make more sense. So using the borders may help you visualize. And we're going to go from the bottom up. So the bottom of that V stack, we have a border around it that's in indigo, and that's what you can see in the outside. Inside that, you can see padding around basically what's pushing that indigo border out to the outside. Padding's often used. Inside that padding, we have a green border that wraps the V stack. There's a border around the text, which is cyan, which you can kind of see a little bit on the top part of that. And so on. So these are the views, right? The image and the text, those are the views. And also the VStack is considered a container view. So a VStack is a view that can contain other views. Same thing with HStack or ZStack. So the VStack is a view and it contains other views. And then the modifiers are these. So setting the image scale, the foreground style, border, all the borders, the padding is even considered a view modifier. This padding in this case is modifying the VStack view. We're putting padding around the view, right? So let's now, we've kind of taken a look at the default app and what that looks like, and we've kind of visualized it in a way that maybe helps to make sense. Let's start to construct our app. So where in the world do we start? So again, we're not going to be writing a ton of code. I'm gonna help you with that, but we're gonna be constructing this thing together. So where do we begin? There's a short link here. I'm going to leave this up on the screen for a minute. This is where this is going to get you a zip file that contains the files that we'll use in our product or in our project. Sorry, I'll leave this up. I think there's 5 or 6 files in that zip file. And at the end of this, if for some reason you're like, hey, I don't care, and then you suddenly care later, there'll be a link at the end of this slide that where you can access these as well. Any issues getting that? All good? Word. So this is what you're going to get. And like I said in my last talk, I kind of like Keynote, and I'll show you some neat things that are really like way over the top, but cool. So here we go. So again, this is essentially what you downloaded if you extract that zip file and go into the directory. But we're going to kind of bring some of those things into the project. We're going to talk about each one of these as we go as well. What is also in here that is not in this screenshot is an example signed profile. Does everybody see that? Word. Okay, so let's do this. Let's drag a few of these files. This is how you drag the file into Xcode. There's another way you can do this by right-clicking in the sidebar and adding files, but this way just looks super cool, so this is how I did it. So here we're just dragging this constants file into the sidebar, and there's a little banner there. And then you'll see this dialog where we're basically, it is ensuring that you want to add that file into the application itself. This should be pretty straightforward. You shouldn't have to adjust anything, and then you can click Finish. And this is what that file looks like. Very simple. Basically what we're doing here, hopefully you can see that, we're defining, again, it's not really a talk specifically about Swift and how you write Swift, but I guess if you think about Bash, all the variables that you initialize, it's all strings. Even the integer is basically a string. In Swift, you define the type of variable. In this case, we're defining a URL, and we're using a string to actually do the initialization. This link is directly from the macadmins.psu.edu website. This is essentially the logo. So we're basically creating a variable that holds the URL of that logo, right? And we're going to use that later. The reason why you don't have to do this, what's cool about creating a separate file and putting like a variable, for instance, at the root of the file, is that variable is now available to the entire project. So if you were to create this variable within a view or something like that, it's only available within that view, which would be okay, but it takes up too much room in my view to display. And you often need to leverage something like this where you have just kind of constants that you don't need that are big, or it could be a multi-line string or something like that. So that's what I've done here. Let's talk about SwiftUI data models, and we'll look at our data model first. And if you've looked at the file, you're probably going like, what the heck is this? And we'll talk about that. But what is a data model? So when you create a SwiftUI app, typically you're not just going to have one view that does all these things. You're going to separate the components of the app out. And the SwiftUI data model, sometimes called a view model, basically separates the business logic from the view. So things like things that you're doing in the background, you can use data models to notify the view to make updates using these what's called publish properties. Manages and propagates errors that occur in background tasks. So again, you can do background tasks in the data model, again, separate from the view, and then you can basically propagate changes from the view model to the view, and I'll show you examples of that too. And I started with this first because we kind of need this to move forward, but it's definitely the most complicated part of the app. You typically should have a view model if you're doing anything even slightly kind of complex, and it's a good practice to use a view model when you make a SwiftUI app. And that architecture is not necessarily related specifically to SwiftUI. It's kind of view models are kind of in lots of programming languages specifically about apps. This is our view model. This should be identical to the view model that or the profile manager.swift file that you downloaded, and we're going to go through it piece by piece. So yeah, the profile manager, we're basically creating a class here. And again, it's not really a talk about Swift, but we're going to give you a good example. Typically a data model, you would want it to essentially leverage observable object or conform to observable object so that something can observe the changes that are happening. The view is going to observe the changes that this view model publishes to the view, if that makes sense. I think it will as we move on. But right now, basically the published variables, basically the properties that we're going to publish to the view are outlined here. The first one is this selected profile. So again, we're gonna allow the user to select a profile, and then we're going to try to unsign it, export it, and unsign it. So the selected profile is going to be one of the properties that we publish to the view. What you can actually do, which is kind of cool, is when the user selects the profile, we're going to populate this variable, right? But when this variable is set, you can run some arbitrary code. So if you use this did set, essentially a code block, you can run something. In this case, what I'm doing is when the user selects a profile, and they'll do that by URL, they won't know they're doing that. They're just going to select it in the file system. We're gonna basically create a name of the file, which is basically the last part of the file name. So we're going to remove everything but the last portion of the file path, and that's going to be our name of the file. We'll use that later. These other properties, again, we're setting profile name up above. Profile icon, we want to display an icon. Again, it's not really necessary in the functionality of the app, but it's a cool example for you to use if you want to modify this app to do something else. What I kind of skipped, should present alert and alert message. Basically, if there's an error, we're going to populate those properties, and we'll publish those changes of, say, if there was an error to the view. And if you see, if you kind of, think about Bash, you would do like this variable equals whatever. You do the same thing in Swift. Basically, if we look at the last variable there, var alert message is a string. We're not initializing that variable. So it's got no value right now, which you can't really do. So what I have here is an initializer, so that when we initialize this data model, we're going to set these variables within the initializer. So the selected profile we're going to set to essentially an empty. It's nothing because nothing's selected yet. The profile name is empty. The profile icon, we're using AppKit essentially NS Workspace to get the icon for a mobile config file. So instead of taking the ICNS from the mobile config file and embedding it in the app, we actually just read what the icon for a mobile config file is. So we're going to do that there. Should present alert, that's a Boolean property. We're setting that to false. So basically there's no alert, there's no message for the alert either. So we're just setting up the properties here when this view model loads. So yeah, there's the icon for the mobile config. Should present alert is false. And I'm just saying things twice now. So as we move on, we're going to create a function when a user clicks a button to open a file panel and allow the user to select files. So we're using NS Open Panel, which technically is not, it's what you would use with a storyboard if you were making an app with storyboard. You can do this more in a SwiftUI way, but it's more complicated and harder to present. So I'm using NS Open Panel. And then for that variable panel, we're basically setting up properties in terms of what we're kind of boxing the user in and what they can select. So can they choose files? Yes. Can they choose directories? No. Can they select multiple files? No. What content types? What types are they allowed to select in that open panel? Mobile config. When the user selects a file in that panel, we're going to do something. So again, when you need to separate what things happen in the background from the things that you need to do in the UI. The things that you need to do in the UI take precedence over everything. And you always do that on the main thread. And you could do several talks about background threads versus main threads. But in this case, you just need to know that if we need to do anything that updates a view, you want to do that on the main thread. Excuse me. And this is how you would do that. So when the user selects something on the main thread, or when the user selects a profile, we're going to set the property, and we're going to do that on the main thread so that the UI can be updated on the main thread. So we need another panel to save this mobile config file. So in this case, there's an ns save panel. We're just setting a property here, which is the default name of the profile. So basically what we're doing is we're saying, okay, the user selected a profile named, signed profile.mobileconfig. Well, what they're going to save it as, we can set the default name for that file too. So we're going to set the default name of that file to the file name that they selected. If for some reason that's not available, which shouldn't happen, this is just making sure we don't have errors. We set a default. And again, the allowed content types, what you're going to save it as is a mobile config. So we're not going to allow you to save it as a text file. You're going to save it as a mobile config. And when essentially the user chooses the location where they want to save that file to, we're going to perform an action, and that's in this panel.begin. This section here should never occur because we're gonna only allow this function to run when there's a profile selected. So this is just, again, making sure we don't have any weird errors. This should never occur. That guard statement basically means, hey, if there's no profile selected, then we're going to just die. And then the action that we actually take when the user saves, we're gonna again do this on the main thread. We're going to unsign the profile. We've created this function below. I'll show you what that is, but basically we're going to unsign the profile they selected. We're going to save it to the destination they selected. And here's our unsigned profile function that we created. Here's where we're going to run a shell command. So it's kind of neat. So this function that we're going to use, we've called it unsigned profile. It takes two parameters. One, the source. This is the source that they've selected. The second one, destination. This is the destination they've selected. Both URLs, which basically are file paths in kind of a URL format. It's like file : / another / and then the path. In this case, this is an action we're going to take on the background thread. So we're going to do this in the background, and we're going to essentially use a QoS of user initiated. So this is a higher priority. So it's technically not a background thread. It's a thread that occurs in the background that we're saying the user initiated this, so it takes priority. It's really kind of unnecessary, but to do it on a user initiated thread, but that's what we're doing. And so here's where what I kind of passed up. If I go back, let's go back. Yeah. So here's our command. If you like I said, if you committed that command to memory, it should look like this. You have to define the full path of the command that you want to run. What you actually can do is that full path can be bin bash, and then your arguments can be -c and then a string of a command if you wanted to do that. So you could run anything you want that includes pipes and things like that. But in this case, we're just leveraging the security command. We're using essentially the same command. The arguments property is an array of our arguments, just like in our command. The output of this process, we're going to capture in what's called a pipe. We're then going to launch the process. We're going to run the command. Typically, we have kind of a synchronous versus asynchronous processes that happen in SwiftUI, Swift command line tools, and we want to wait until this finishes. Otherwise, if you didn't have this wait until exit, this command wouldn't necessarily work the way you expected. So we're going to wait till this process ends. We're going to read the output in the pipe. So if we catch an error, we can handle that. And here's where we determine the status of the command. Did it terminate successfully or not? So if we terminate with 0, and if you're familiar with kind of shell and just exit codes in general, 0 typically means okay, unless someone didn't handle errors correctly. And in this case, we're gonna take action on the main thread. This is kind of unnecessary because we're just printing to the screen. But typically, any action that you'd want to take, you typically would want to perform some action on the UI. You would do that on the main thread. If for some reason that command failed, that's would be in this block. Again, we're going to take action on the main thread. In this case, we're going to create an error. We're going to populate some properties with either the output of the command or it would be an unknown error. And we're setting this should present alert variable to true. And I'll show you what that's going to do. If for some reason, if you see output that's something like problem decoding, that typically means that that profile is not signed. So you will be able to select a profile that's not signed. And this is where we'll catch that error if we're trying to unsign an unsigned profile, if that makes sense. In the example profile that I gave you, you shouldn't see this, but if you just have an unsigned profile laying around, you'll see this error being propagated to the screen. And then here, we're basically, UT type is a way that you can define file types. There are built-in kind of file types that you can use in Swift. And mobile config is not one of those. So we're basically creating our own version of a UT type or that file type, which we're using here in this kind of allowed content types and so on throughout the process. And again, this is the most complicated part. So before I move on, any questions about that? And if you don't have a question now, and you have a question in the hall, let me know, and I'll wait. Moving on. Okay, so now let's get into some easier stuff. This is the new app file struct. So we're basically adjusting this now, and I'll show you how we're going to be adjusting this. So what we're doing here is we're going to take our profile manager. This is the class that we just created, and we're going to initialize it here. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow that data model to be available throughout the whole app. So you could make this available in a specific view, but we want this just available in the entire app. And that's typically when you have like a shared data model. All these properties that you want to update and update UIs could be in different views. When you initialize these data models here in the app struct, you can make them available in the entire app using this environment object where I'm basically injecting that as kind of like an environmental variable in the app itself. Some kind of less cool things. I'm basically I'm defining the size of the window here. I'm adding a title to the window, and then I'm removing the ability to resize that window. Again, all optional, but kind of cool to have examples of how you can actually do that. If we take a look at kind of a cool view of the app, this is, again, that URL that we created in the constants, that's the URL, or that's the image that is on the other end of that URL. So this is a view. Again, I'm sprinkling this with examples of kind of cool things. We're setting a property here to determine if we're hovering over the image, and we'll show you what we're doing with that. But the main portion of the view, this particular view is only related to this image. And there's a cool thing that SwiftUI has called async image, which basically allows you to download an image from the web, and while you're downloading the image from the web, you can display another view. So what we're going to be actually displaying is a progress view, and I'll show you that. But this async image takes three parameters. One is the URL. One is the content, which is basically the other end of that URL, which is the image, and what we're going to do with the image, in which case for us, we're going to display the image, and a placeholder, which is the view that we're going to display while the image is downloading. So hopefully you don't see a progress bar for very long, but you probably will. So again, that URL, we're going to just reference the PSU logo that we referenced earlier. What happens when that image is downloaded? So we're setting an image variable, and then here we're just doing something with the image. And in this case, what we're doing is displaying the image. We're setting the aspect ratio to fit, which basically doesn't distort the aspect ratio. And then we're actually putting a background behind the image that is a circle. So we're creating a white circle, which is kind of on the outside of that image, right? So the reason why I did that is because the image is kind of, it's a little weird. It kind of looks odd on a black background. You won't be able to see the blue because it kind of fades in. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding a shadow. And that shadow you can't see in dark mode, but in light mode, you'll see a shadow around the white of the image. So it'll stick out. It's funny when I go and kind of switch to light mode, like I'm initially blinded because it's so bright. But yeah, if you have a white image, it's very hard to see in light mode. So I'm basically adding a shadow around it specifically for white mode. And then oddly enough, that image is actually skewed a little bit. So I'm adjusting the offset of that image within the circle. And then again, while that image is downloading, we can display another view. It could be whatever we want. It could be text that says downloading file. It could be whatever. In this case, we're going to use a view that's called progress view, which looks something like this. So while that image is downloading, you're going to see a progress bar that looks like this. And then when the image is done downloading, it's going to swap to the image. So instead of having, oftentimes what you'll see is if you have a bunch of images that you're displaying in kind of a stack, you don't want to have just a blank area. You want to have something fill that space. So in this case, it's going to be a progress view. So as we move on, again, some of this is unnecessary. It's more just, hey, I want to give you cool examples of some things you can do. So on hover here. So we talked about the property that we initialize at the top for when someone hovers over it. So essentially, when someone moves the mouse over this image, we're going to perform an action. In this case, what we're going to do is set that is hovering variable that we initialize at the top to the status of the hover. It's going to be true or false, basically. So when someone hovers over the image, we're going to set this property to true. So we're just setting this property to true when someone hovers over the image, and we'll do something with that. What we're going to do is create a popover over the image when someone hovers over it. So to display the popover, again, if you were to do this with a storyboard, there'd be so much more code and so much more like creating objects in the storyboard. This makes it much easier to do, and it's very powerful. So we're basically determining if we present that popover based off that is hovering variable here. And what I do with the $, basically what that does is it binds that property there to the value of the is hovering property. It's kind of weird, but that's how you do a popover with a binding to a property. And what is displayed in that popover is get your hover on, and that's what it would look like. You hover over the image, you'll see a popover. Again, it's kind of like why, but it's a cool. This is something that apps have. Maybe not in this case, but they have a popover. It's as easy as that to get it set up. And then at the end, basically, I'm just defining the size of this view, and then I'm wrapping it with a padding, which is why you can see kind of padding around the image itself. Boom, padding. Logo view questions. Anything related specifically to the logo view? You have the file. It's I want to say straightforward. The cool thing about Swift is like even if you don't know it, you can kind of tell what's going on a little bit. And I've added comments in there so that it provides some context. Moving on. The next thing is button views. So the buttons that the user is going to use to select a profile and then use to export. So we're creating a view. We created a view specifically for the image, and now we're creating a view specifically for the buttons, and we'll tie that all together shortly. Again, that profile manager class we'll be using as well. And here in the default app, we had a VStack where we're stacking things vertically. Here you can see these two buttons are stacked horizontally. I'm adding a spacing here between the buttons. That spacing of 20 that's basically the default padding spacing. If you were interested, so I'm basically separating the objects in this stack with spacing. The first element of this stack is a button, and that button is the select profile button, and this is kind of all the components of the button. The button has two parts. It's an action and the label. What are we going to do when the user clicks a button, and what does the button look like? So in this case, the action we're going to take is we're going to use that profile manager class that we created, our data model. We're going to run that open file panel function. So that file panel is going to open up when the user clicks this button. The label is basically, again, what that button looks like. So that button is an H stack where we have the label on one side and the image on the other. The text is select profile, and then we have an image. Here's where the SF Symbols app comes in. So this checkmark.seal.fill, like, where does this thing come from? It comes from this. So SF Symbols app, there's literally over 5,000 icons in this app. It's kind of ridiculous. And there's variations of each icon. But in this case, I just search for seal. You can click on the seal here that you want. And then this is basically the identifier of that image, which is what we use there. So that's a way that you can, it's pretty easy to use those system images in SwiftUI, and hopefully that's helpful for you. And that's kind of what the image looks like. If you can see that, kind of like a little profile there. And then here, again, not necessary, but cool to have an example. Basically, it's setting a keyboard shortcut. When we run this app, at the end of this, you can actually just click Command-O, and we'll open the file panel. And we'll do the same thing for the other one, too. So that's how you can create a keyboard shortcut for this button instead of actually clicking on the button. And then the next element of this stack is the kind of export button. The action we'll take is the save file panel function that we defined. So this is where the user is going to be able to choose where they save the file to. And then again, a different image. This is kind of the universal export image here. And again, another keyboard shortcut of S, which is Command-S. It's kind of what everybody uses for save. And then we actually have the opportunity to disable that button. You can see it's grayed out. And we disable it based on if the user has selected a profile. So we're not going to allow the user to click the export button if they've not selected a profile. So they select a profile, we populate that selected profile property, and then the export button becomes available. And then here, basically I'm wrapping that entire H stack with a modifier where I'm basically defining the control size of the button. These buttons, if you've noticed, are slightly larger than typical buttons. And again, unnecessary, kind of a neat way to do it. You could actually use that control size modifier for each button, but because we're going to do that for both buttons, it makes more sense to eliminate one line of code and just wrap the entire H stack with the modifier. Buttons view questions. I'm assuming, yes, we have one. Here, let's see, can we hand this back? Let's go. Let's do this. Chuck it.
So in that last view, you added padding to both of the views by adding padding at the end, and the control size.
Yeah.
Coming from web development and CSS sort of background, is there a similar way to do things like applying borders or font sizes or colors or what have you to everything in all of the stuff below a certain level, so that it's cascading style sheets? Is that the way you would do that for, say, like when you're debugging, you want to add padding to everything, or you want to add a border to everything? Could you just add it to the whole view and then everything inside of that view?
Yeah,
that border?
yeah, that's basically what I'm doing here. At the bottom, we're adding padding, and that the padding that we're adding is around the outside of both buttons. You could add padding to one button and to the other button, but what you'd have is you'd have the buttons would have padding on each side, so they'd be further apart. So in this case...
That's what I'm asking is there a... so you're adding padding to the view that contains both buttons.
Right.
Is there a way to, with one line or one instance or whatever, apply padding to each of the items within? And
I'll show you an example of why you wouldn't be able to do that. you might be able to do something like that, but in the
You may
next,
not always want to, but if you're
Yeah,
if
the
you
next
wanna
file-
debug and it's like I want to border around everything, or
Yeah.
I want to make the font color of everything in this, sort of inherit from here down.
yeah, the next file that I show is going to take these views that we've created and make a container that contains all the views. So if you were to apply padding there, it's going to be padding around the outside of that.
Right, but it's not going to inherit and then add padding
No.
to each element with
No,
That's
it's
where-
basically
that's
the
where I
padding is for that specific view, and it doesn't, your call out about like if you look at control size, well, that basically makes each button that's in that view use that control size, but the padding only applies to the view itself.
Okay.
Cool, good question. Hey, you want a bird for asking a question? Boom! Hopefully you can get it. I got plenty of these. So yeah, good question. Any more on that? Okay, cool. So here's where, and I can kind of show you where you maybe would do that, but again, it's going to wrap all of this in padding instead of apply the padding like in kind of an inheriting way. So in this case, the content view, again, the default app had a content view, which was image, hello world in a VStack. So we're basically modifying that. This is again is going to be we're going to include the environmental object that we've passed in, the profile manager. We're going to use that. We have a VStack here, and then this is how we can basically embed that logo view that we created in this file. So what we're going to show here is you can create views elsewhere, embed them in the content view or in other views, or you can create the view here. So this could have been its own view too, and it could be in a separate file, and then I could have referenced it like I did here. But this shows you an example of how you can take an external view, include that in your app, and then create a view kind of in line and show that as well. In this case, this view basically is going to be in between the logo and your buttons, and it's basically just going to display either no profile selected if no one's selected a profile, or the profile name. And then, yeah, the text is a profile name. And we're actually taking the icon that we've created in that profile manager, and we're going to display that. So we'll see what that looks like. And yeah, if for some reason somebody hasn't selected a profile, it will say no profile selected. And then our buttons view that we just created is going to be at the bottom. So we're going to have image, some text, which is the profile, and then your buttons at the bottom of this VStack. And then again, if there are errors, you should do something with those. The user should be presented. This is, the way I'm doing it is kind of quick and dirty. You probably should create like a custom error object and actually define custom errors. But in this case, basically, if we've caught an error and we've set that should present alert property in our data model to true, we're going to display an alert. And in that alert, we're going to display the message that we've generated in our profile manager class. And we're setting a frame. Basically, we're allowing that alert to be as big as it needs to be to display the text. And what that would look like, again, is presented. We're using a binding of that profile manager, should present alert, and the text here, and it would look like this. If for some reason, this is what you'll see if you try to assign profile, you'll see this error because we catch that in the profile manager class. So now, if anybody's built the app, does it function? Because it really shouldn't. Go ahead. Yeah.
He can't hear you.
There-
The catch box. Look out behind you.
So there were a couple of errors, but they were both Xcode related to give the app the ability to access the network. I couldn't, I had to.
You're ahead of me. You're ahead of me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're good. No, you're good. That's good that if you get to this point, you're golden because we're going to get it to work. So yeah, app sandbox. That's the reason why it doesn't work. So what is the app sandbox? It's basically a way that Apple has defined these applications can limit the destruction that they can do. So again, isolates apps from each other and from the system. You can basically limit that potential damage if for some reason the application contains malware, for instance, which this one should not, because these are not, you put the files in, okay? I didn't do that. So yeah, if for some reason the app becomes compromised, the app sandbox could potentially protect from that. You don't have to have an app sandbox enabled. If you create an app and you want to distribute it at your organization, you don't have to use the app sandbox. If you submit an app to the Mac App Store, you have to use the app sandbox. Yeah, it's just a protection that Apple provides. It's actually pretty cool. So apps can request access to certain things. You've all seen these requests for, hey, the app wants to have access to your downloads folder. The app wants to use microphone, these types of things. So the app can request access for those things. And these protections basically help improve security and privacy. So it's actually kind of cool. So I'll show you how to rectify that. So basically, if you go into, I think I have arrows here. Yeah, so if you click here in the sidebar, basically the product itself, and then you go to signing and capabilities, there's an app sandbox section. And hopefully you can see this. Basically, there's outgoing connections, so we need to go get that image, right? So if you have this unchecked, you're for sure going to see that progress bar, because that image is not going to be able to load. So you'll just see a progress bar spinning the entire time. And then the other portion, by default, the user can select any file in an app. There's no, by default, it's set to, if a user selects the file, the app can read that file. We actually have to switch this to read and write so we can do the export. If you don't do the lower permission, then you can read the file and you'll just get an error on the export, which is probably the error that you were seeing. So yeah, once you build the app, again, you can hit the play button or Command B. That app would look like this. And at this point, you should be able to select the profile that I've included in the sample documents if you're following along, and then export that and save it somewhere else. You get all kind of the cool dialogues. If you try to save it as the same name in the same directory, it will prompt you, do you want to replace it? And you can do that. And this time, actually, you did it. You actually did do it. So we actually got through that. Yes. So this is what it looks like. Did anybody get it to work? Yes. Yes, it works. Cool. So yeah, again, it would have been, I did have slides prepared to okay, here's how you initialize constants and variables and what the difference is and functions and things like that. But I feel like, the big thing that we want to do is be able to create an app. And this is a good example of something that you can do. And running a shell command in an app is like something where people are like, oh, I really want to do that. Even though the big thing that you want to do is convert everything to Swift. But I don't think there's an API to unsign a profile. So you get an example of running a shell command. You can customize that. I mean, if you think about, if you want to take a file in and do something to it and then save it out, you have kind of the framework in order to do that. So here's me. Any questions on anything? We kind of went short. There's a lot of stuff that we went over, but happy to answer any questions that anybody has about anything. Want to throw the hit this guy in the gray with that thing? There we go.
Just a question about the app sandbox.
Yes.
So you have to have permission with the PPPC, right, to ask if you can access the file and downloads documents wherever. But what about how you're using a command line tool? So do you have to have access to get to the user bin folder, or is that?
Nope, not by default.
Okay.
Now, there could be situations where, say, if you wanted to, you've all probably ran some command in terminal that requires some level of access, PPPC access, right? You're not going to get around that. You're still running a command. You're just doing it within the app and not in terminal. So say if you run the command in terminal and it requires full disk access for, like terminal requires full disk access to run that command, this app would need to do the same thing if you were needing to do something that required full disk access. Good question. You want a bird? Here, grab a bird. Hey! Any more questions? It's a electrona bird. It's a finch, zebra finch. Yeah. Yeah, peaches, yeah.
All right, I need a license plate of that truck. Sorry about that. That's okay, I should have had my head out.
So SwiftUI has been around for a couple of years now. Are there any things that it can't do versus using like I guess it was the document builder or the canvas in Xcode?
Yeah, storyboards.
Storyboards, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are views that are available in storyboards that are not available in SwiftUI. There are some, the way, for example, you have like a linear progress view, the way it looks and the way you move the progress bar is different in SwiftUI. Maybe not as good, maybe better, depends on who you ask. So there are definitely differences between storyboard and SwiftUI. I mean, I feel like, if you want to make an app, you should do it in SwiftUI because potentially storyboards are going to go away, right? I think in terms of user interface, like Apple has specific guidelines, right, on how they want the app to look, and those things are going to be pretty easy to do in SwiftUI. But yeah, there definitely are some things that you can do in with a storyboard that you can't do in SwiftUI, but vice versa too. So yeah, good question. Anything else?
So, on your journey to your level of where you're at with this, what has been your best resource when you were at a loss for what class or what function to use? I've got a bit of experience doing simple apps like you did here, and my biggest issue is finding examples that related to what I'm trying to do.
Right.
Because there's not a lot out there. It's not easy to find.
Yeah, and that's really why the idea for this talk came about, where I was like, okay, like I said, you can find a lot of examples for iOS apps and SwiftUI related to iOS apps, even Swift with storyboards related to iOS apps back in the day, because that's what everybody wants to make an iOS app, and that's what everybody has questions about iOS apps. So it's kind of unfortunate. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of things that you can glean from iOS related to SwiftUI. I mean, I guess Google is your friend, I guess, that seems to be the best resource for me. Apple's documentation is good. I mean, obviously there's a ton of it. And then again, just seeing examples of things, trying to, figuring out what you can do. This is, I made another very complicated SwiftUI app that's for our patch product that is basically, I mean, there's a lot to it, but can create a mobile config file based off customizations that you create in the GUI. That was, it was a big learning curve to go from making, like you said, simple apps to like a full-blown SwiftUI application. So yeah, it's unfortunate that there aren't a ton of resources out there specifically for macOS and what you can do on macOS. I wish I had a better answer, but yeah, there's just Google, I guess. Good question, though. Thanks.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right. Well, I guess that is it. If anybody has issues with the app, has any questions, hit me in the hallway, or I'll be around here for a few minutes. I don't mind coming and taking a look at what you have, and yeah, thanks.